Nevada Territory, 1874, the wind howled over the open basin near Pyramid Lake, dragging dust across the bones of old dreams and the heavy silence of a town that had long forgotten how to hope. Grace O'Malley sprinted out the back door of the saloon with a shotgun in one hand and her braided hair flying like a whip behind her. Her boots hit hard, packed dirt as she dodged behind the horse trough, breath sharp in her lungs. "Get her!" a man's voice shouted from the front, boots crashing on the boardwalk. "She broke his damn nose." Grace grinned, wiped blood from her split lip and cocked the shotgun. "He grabbed my thigh." "He's lucky that's all I broke." She waited until the shouting faded before slipping around the corner and disappearing into the shadows behind the blacksmiths. Her ribs ached. Her pride burned hotter. They said she was too wild for a wife, too quick with her fists, too sharp with her tongue. Too much, she did not disagree. Not far from town, Israel Boone rode into the valley on a chestnut mare, dust caked along his hat brim and the trail behind him long and lonely. His coat was sun-bleached, same as his eyes. He had a rifle tied to his saddle and a quietness about him that made most men keep their distance. He was looking for a place to settle, maybe even rebuild the ranch his brother died defending during the war. He was not looking for a woman. But then again, he never expected Grace O'Malley to come barreling across the road in front of his horse, shotgun still in hand, hair half undone. What in God's? He yanked the reins. Grace paused, chest heaving. "You going to shoot me or help me?" Israel blinked. "That depends." "Did you kill someone?" "No," she said, then shrugged. "Not today." She dropped the shotgun into the dust, hands raised. "I just need a horse and a head start." Israel dismounted, slow and calm. "You hurt?" "Only my pride." He picked up the shotgun, handed it back. "Well, pride heals slower than bones. Come on, you can ride with me." Grace eyed him. "You make a habit of helping women being chased out of town." "No," he said, mounting up and reaching for her. "But something tells me you are not just any woman." She hesitated, then took his hand and swung up behind him. As they rode out through the basin, her arms slipped around his waist not because she wanted to, but because she needed to hold on. He said nothing about it, just kept the horse steady and the pace easy. They rode until dusk painted the sky in red and gold. Israel stopped near a creek, unsaddled the mare, and started a fire. Grace watched him quietly. His movements were steady, no wasted motion. He cooked beans in a dented tin pot and handed her a plate like they had done this 100 times. "You got a name?" he asked after a while. "Grace O'Malley." He raised an eyebrow. "Like the Irish pirate," she nodded. "My father liked stories." "Thought it would make me brave." Israel stirred the fire. "Seems it worked." Grace leaned back on her elbows, the firelight flickering across her bruised cheek. "What about you?" "Israel Boone," she smiled. "That sounds made up." "It is not." They sat in silence. Crickets sang, the fire popped. Grace's shoulders slowly lowered, her breathing evened out. "Why were they chasing you?" he asked. She looked away. "Because I refuse to keep quiet when men think they can touch what ain't theirs." Israel's jaw tightened. "That man hurt you?" "No," she said, "but he thought he could." "I made sure he knew better." Israel nodded. "Then you did right." Grace looked at him, surprised. "Most men would say I should have walked away." He met her eyes. "Most men are cowards." She studied him a little longer, then said softly, "They said I was too wild for a wife." Israel smiled, eyes still on the fire. "That is what I like best." Grace blinked, her breath catching in her throat. No one had ever said that to her before. They spent the night at the creek. Grace slept curled near the fire, Israel close but respectful. When she woke, he was cooking again, quiet as ever. Over the next few days, they rode together. Grace told him about her childhood in California, how her parents died of cholera when she was 16, how she worked saloons to survive. She had been alone ever since. "No family, no home. They all say I am too much," she said on the fourth night, her voice low. "Too loud, too angry. Too stubborn." Israel reached out and tucked one of her loose curls behind her ear. "They do not know what they are talking about." Her breath hitched. She looked at his hand, then at his face. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." They camped near an abandoned homestead the next afternoon. Israel walked the land, eyes thoughtful. "I could fix this place up. Good soil, water's close, enough room for a few horses. Grace stood beside him, arms crossed. You planning on doing that alone? He looked at her. Not if you are still here. I thought you were not looking for a wife. His gaze held hers. I was not, but now I am not so sure. Grace's heart thudded hard. She turned away, pretending to check the saddle. You do not even know what you are asking. I am asking if you want a chance, he said gently. Not a promise, just a chance. You and me, no one else's opinion. She did not answer right away. But that night, when he laid out his bedroll, she moved hers a little closer, just a little. By the end of the week, they had cleared out the old homestead, repaired the roof, and patched the windows. Grace found a chicken coop half buried in weeds and laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Israel watched her, something soft in his eyes. They shared meals, shared work, shared long glances across the firelight. He never tried to tame her, never asked her to be quiet. He just listened, understood, stayed, and she stayed too. On the 10th day, a storm rolled over the hills. Rain slammed down, thunder echoing across the basin. Grace stood in the doorway, soaked and laughing, arms wide. You are crazy, Israel shouted over the wind. She turned, grinning. Then why are you smiling? He grabbed her hand and pulled her inside. The door slammed shut behind them. They stood close, soaked through, hearts racing. Grace, he said, voice rough. Yes, I do not want you to go. She looked up at him, eyes wide. Then do not let me. He kissed her like he had been waiting his whole life to do that, and she kissed him back like she had finally found the one person who saw all of her and stayed anyway. They did not sleep apart after that, and Israel never once asked her to be less than everything she was. The wind quieted after the storm, leaving the world rinsed clean. Israel stood in the doorway of the half-mended homestead, one hand braced against the frame, watching Grace tug a line of wet clothes off the rope they'd strung between the barn and the sycamore. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her arms streaked with mud. She worked with a kind of fierce focus that made it hard to look away. He stepped down into the yard. You always wash everything after a storm. Grace glanced up, brushed damp hair from her cheek. You'd be surprised what mildew can do when you're not paying attention. Looks like you've fought it before. Once had a whole trunk of linens go green after a flood in Placerville. Took me weeks to air out the smell. Israel chuckled low in his throat. Remind me not to leave you in charge of the laundry. You planning on handing over chores already? She asked, folding a shirt with brisk precision. That's bold for a man who hasn't even laid fence yet. I was waiting on the ground to soften. It has now. She handed him a bundle of dry shirts. Then I reckon you're out of excuses. He nodded toward the barn. You want to help me set posts? She cocked her head. You think I don't? They worked through the morning, moving in rhythm without needing many words. Grace held posts steady while Israel tamped the earth, then handed him nails from the pouch tied at her hip. Sweat lined her temples, and her hands blistered at the base of her fingers, but she didn't flinch. When they paused for water, she leaned against the fence and looked out over the land with a quiet expression he hadn't seen before. This place could be something, she said. If you're patient with it. Israel took the canteen from her, drank, then said, I've got time. She looked at him sidelong. You always this steady, he shrugged. Spent enough years chasing things that didn't hold. Figured I'd try staying still. Grace ran her thumb along a fresh splinter in the rail. I never stayed anywhere long. Always figured if I did, someone'd try to change me. Maybe you just hadn't found the right place to stand still. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on his face a little longer than they had before. By evening, the fence line stretched clean across the north edge. Grace sat on the porch steps, a cloth wrapped around her raw palms. Israel sank beside her, his back aching, his hands stained with dirt. He set the hammer down with a grunt. You ever think about what it'd be like, he said, to build something that lasted? Grace tilted her head. You mean like a house? I mean like a life. The sun dipped low behind the hills. Grace looked out across the land where the golden light caught on the fresh posts they'd planted together. I don't know what a life like that looks like, she said, quiet. But maybe I'd like to find out. He didn't reach for her, didn't push, just let the silence stretch until she filled it. I used to think wanting more meant I was ungrateful, she went on. Like I should be thankful just to have a roof, a job, food on a plate, but I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be wanted for who I am, not because I'm easy or agreeable or convenient. Israel's voice was steady. I see you, Grace, she turned toward him. Her eyes didn't shine, but something in them softened like a knot pulled loose. Then I reckon I might be ready to stop running. That night, Israel brought in the last of the firewood while Grace lit the lamp over the table. The shutters rattled in the breeze. He came in and set the kindling by the hearth, then turned to find her already watching him. You hungry? She asked. Some, he said. She crossed to the stove, lifted the lid on the kettle. Beans again, you're welcome to complain. He settled into the chair beside the table. Not when it smells that good. She served him without ceremony, then poured her own. They ate slowly, the scrape of spoons and the crackle of fire the only sounds between them. When she finished, she leaned back, arms folded. What did you do before all this? She asked. Before you came through that basin, worked cattle in Wyoming for a while. Did some freight riding out of Fort Kearney. After my brother was killed, I drifted. She didn't ask how it happened. She just said, you miss him? Every day, she nodded. I had a sister once, younger. Fever took her fast. They sat with that for a moment. Two people who'd lost more than they said, holding the weight of it without needing to explain. Later, when the lamp burned low and the fire dimmed to embers, Grace rose and went to the door. The stars had come out, bright over the ridge. Israel joined her there, shoulder to shoulder. You ever think we're just two runaways that got tired of running the same day? She asked. Maybe, he said, but I don't mind where we ended up. She looked at him, her voice almost too soft to hear. I never thought peace would look like this. He reached down and laced his fingers through hers. She didn't pull away, neither of them said anything else. They didn't have to, the soil held the warmth of late spring. Wild lupine bloomed along the ridge behind the cabin, their soft violet petals stirring in the breeze. Grace knelt by the edge of the new garden bed, her fingers deep in the earth, planting rows of onion sets beside the beans they'd sown 3 days earlier. Israel stood behind her, sharpening the drawknife against a whetstone, the steady rhythm of steel on stone weaving into the hush of the afternoon. You ever plant anything before? She asked without looking up. Not unless you count fence posts. She pressed another bulb into the soil. These take patience, you can't rush them. I can manage that, he paused. But I don't know what I'm looking for when something goes wrong. Grace sat back on her heels, dusting her hands on her skirt. You'll know, leaves turn yellow too soon, they're drowning. Curl in too tight, they're thirsty. Same as people. Israel leaned a shoulder against the porch beam. And how do you tell when someone's just plain tired? Grace looked up, squinting into the light. Depends if they're still trying. He nodded, turned back to the drawknife, and let the silence take hold again. That evening, a rider came down the trail from the east. Grace spotted him first, standing at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. He's not from around here, she said. Israel stepped beside her, watching the figure grow clearer. The rider was lean, with a coat frayed at the cuffs and a rifle strapped across his back. His horse moved slow, like it had been ridden hard for too many miles. The man dismounted without a word, dust falling off him like bark from a dead tree. He tied his reins to the hitching post and looked them both over with a practiced sort of stillness. You Boone? He asked. Israel didn't move. I am. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges. Letter came through Reno from someone named Abigail. Israel's shoulders stiffened. He stepped forward, took the envelope, and turned it over in his hand. The rider nodded once, then swung back into the saddle. No reply needed, I'm just the delivery. They watched him ride off without another word. Grace waited, quiet. Israel opened the letter slow, his eyes scanning the page. When he folded it again, his jaw had gone tight. She's my sister-in-law, he said. I hadn't heard from her since she left Missouri. She's bringing my niece west, said they're headed for Virginia City. Grace's gaze didn't waver. You want to meet them? I should, she nodded once. Then we'll go. He looked at her, brow furrowed. You don't have to, I know. They left at first light, Grace riding the dun mare they'd acquired from a neighboring homesteader in trade for mending harnesses. The ride south took 3 days, the trail winding through limestone cliffs and juniper groves. They camped near hot springs one night, the steam rising ghost-like through the pines. Grace sat with her knees drawn up, watching the fire. Israel carved a strip of cedar into a spoon, his hands working slow and steady. "Why'd you stop writing to her?" she asked. "I didn't think she wanted to hear from me." Grace didn't push. She just nodded and reached for another log. Virginia City lay like a scar across the slope, crowded with clapboard buildings and the scent of coal smoke. They found Abigail in a boarding house above a bakery, her hands red from scrubbing laundry and her face drawn from travel. The girl beside her looked up with wide, solemn eyes, her hair in 2 rough braids and her dress too short at the ankles. "Her name's Hannah," Abigail said. "She's 9. She doesn't remember her father much." Israel crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "You look like him." Hannah didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. They stayed 2 days in town. Grace took Hannah to the stables while Israel helped Abigail secure a parcel of land near the river. That night they sat in the boarding house parlor, the fire low, the windows rattling with distant wind. Abigail sat with her mending, eyes tired but kind. "She's quiet," Grace said, "but sharp." "She doesn't trust easy," Abigail replied. "Takes after her uncle." Grace smiled faintly. "He's not as hard as he pretends." Abigail gave her a long look. "He's softer now than I've ever seen him." Grace didn't answer. She folded her hands in her lap and let the fire crackle between them. On the ride back north, Israel carried a new saddlebag inside it, a small wooden box carved with Hannah's initials. Grace didn't ask what was inside. She just watched the way he rode, how his shoulders sat differently now, like a weight had been shifted but not lifted. They reached the homestead under a sky thick with stars. The cabin waited, still and familiar. Grace dismounted and led the mare to the lean-to, her steps quiet in the dark. Inside, Israel lit the lamp and set the wooden box on the mantel. Grace hung up her coat and stood beside him. "She's a good girl," she said. "She is." They stood in silence a moment longer, then he turned to her. "You sure this is still what you want?" he asked. "All of it, me, the land, the quiet?" "I didn't follow you to Virginia City just to change my mind," his brow furrowed. "You're not afraid it'll be too still here?" Grace stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "Still doesn't mean empty." He let out a slow breath. "I think I want to build more rooms, make space for them if they come visit," she nodded. "We'll need more wood come autumn anyway." He squeezed her hand. "Grace," she met his gaze, "I don't care what they said about you, what they still whisper. You're not too wild for me." Her voice was steady. "And you're not too quiet for me." He kissed her then, slow and certain, like a promise. And when morning came, they were already out by the fence, planning where the new walls would go. In the first weeks of June, the land began to shift. The sagebrush bloomed silver green, and the smell of damp clay rose after every afternoon thundercloud. Grace moved easily through the days now, her body memorized to the rhythm of the place. At dawn, she filled the water pail at the creek. Come midday, she stood at the workbench Israel had built along the cabin's east wall, cutting strips of hide for boot repairs and bridle mending. The sound of the drawknife, the brush of her skirts against the floor, they had become a kind of music. One morning, Israel came in with his hat in his hand and dried blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt," Grace said, setting down the awl. "No," he said, nodding toward the door, but the roan got itself tangled in the barbed wire. Hind legs opened deep. She crossed the room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Go get the boiled cloth. I'll need the clean blade and the lard tin." He hesitated. "You done this before?" She gave him a look. "Have you ever seen me start something I couldn't finish?" They worked side by side in the lean-to. Israel held the gelding's halter, his voice low and steady, while Grace knelt in the dust and stitched the flesh closed with calm fingers and a surgeon's focus. Her braid had come loose at the nape, and sweat streaked her temples, but her hands never wavered. When it was done, she stood and wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "He'll limp a while, but he'll keep his leg." Israel reached for the tin of water and handed it over. "You learn that working saloons?" "No," she said, drinking. "I learned that in a mining camp outside Reading." The cook's boy got his foot crushed under a cart. Nobody else would touch it. I figured I'd rather try than watch him die. He studied her face, quiet. You never told me that. You never asked. The next day, she found him in the barn loft, sorting through the crates they'd left untouched since moving in. She climbed the ladder and sat cross-legged beside him, brushing straw from her sleeves. "What are you looking for?" she asked. He held up a cracked tin full of nails. "Anything worth using." She reached into the box beside him and drew out a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed and curling. "This your brother's?" He nodded. "He kept records of the cattle and the feed. My handwriting's next to his on a few pages. We were supposed to run it together after the war." Grace opened to a page marked with a pressed leaf. It was a list of names. "These folks live nearby?" she asked. "They used to. Some sold out. Some headed east after the drought." Her finger traced the names. "We could ride out, see who's left. If they're still working land, maybe we could trade." Israel leaned back against a beam. "You think they'll talk to us?" "I think they'll talk to me." He raised a brow. "Because they won't expect me to know what I know," she said. "And I don't mind using that." They rode out 2 days later, following the river bend to a long stretch of ranchland where cottonwoods lined the banks. The first place they stopped was a spread run by a man named Jasper Ellis, whose wife kept bees in the barn rafters and offered Grace a jar of honey before even asking her name. Israel spoke with the rancher about lumber and grazing rights. Grace sat with the woman on the porch edge, their knees nearly touching, talking about how to keep moths out of flour sacks and the best way to dry corn for winter. "I thought you was passing through," the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We were," Grace replied. "But the land held us." The woman smiled, slow and knowing. "It does that." They rode home with 3 sacks of seed, a promise of lumber come fall, and a pair of copper pans tied to the saddle horn. That night, Grace placed the honey jar on the center of the table like it was treasure. Israel poured coffee into the tin cups and sat opposite her, his eyes soft in the lamplight. "You belong here," he said. She looked up from the spoon she was carving. "I know." "I don't mean the land," he said. "I mean with me." Grace set the spoon down. "I know that too." He reached across the table and took her hand, rough against rough. "Will you stay for good?" She turned her palm up, fingers closing around his. "This is the first place that's ever asked me to." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Then let it be ours." Their wedding was 3 days later. No preacher, no paper, just the two of them, hands clasped beneath the sycamore, speaking promises into the wind. She wore her work dress, and he wore the blue shirt with the frayed collar she liked best. Afterward, they lay in the grass where the garden would stretch come August, his arm under her head, her cheek against his chest. "You ever think about what they'd say back in town?" she asked. "I don't care. They said I was too wild for a wife." He turned, kissing the point beneath her jaw. "That's what I like best." The summer settled in gentle and dry, the kind of heat that baked the hills pale and cracked the mud around the creek. Grace rose earlier now, her body already tuned to the sun's rise, and Israel often found her outside before first light, pulling up weeds from the garden or tying twine around the tomato stakes. Her movements had grown slower, but not out of fatigue. She was cautious now, careful with how she bent, how she lifted. They hadn't spoken it aloud, but the quiet understanding hung between them like a full water barrel, heavy, waiting. Israel paused by the porch one morning, watching her adjust the hem of her skirt over her boots before kneeling by the corn rows. He walked over, crouched beside her, and rested a hand lightly on her back. She didn't flinch. "You're sure?" She looked at him and nodded once. "I missed a second month." He exhaled through his nose, his palm steady. Grace brushed a curl from her cheek. "You don't have to say anything." "I want to," he said. She waited. "I didn't think I'd get to have this," he said softly. "Not after everything." Grace looked down at the sprouting leaves between them. "Neither did I." They stayed there a while, listening to the wind skimming through the cottonwoods. Then Israel stood and offered her his hand. When she took it, he didn't let go. They spent the next week preparing without speaking the word "baby" aloud. Grace stitched new muslin from scraps Abigail had sent north. Israel built a cradle from pine boards he'd stored behind the lean-to, carving his niece's initials into the underside before sanding it smooth and adding new ones beside it. He showed Grace one evening as the sun dipped behind the ridge. "I didn't want to wait until the last minute," he said. She ran her fingers over the carved G, her throat tightening. "You spelled it right," she whispered. "I asked Abigail to write it down," he admitted. Grace laughed, quick and quiet. "You're getting ahead of yourself." "I want to be ready," he said. "For whatever comes." By late August, they'd added a second room to the cabin. The walls still smelled of sawdust and oil, and Grace lined the windowsill with small river stones she'd gathered on a walk, each one smooth and cool in her palm. Abigail and Hannah arrived in early September, riding in on a borrowed wagon with 2 chickens in a crate and a fresh jar of blackberry preserves. Grace met them at the road with a hand to her back and a broad grin that softened the sharp lines of her face. Hannah climbed down and ran straight to the garden. "These beans are twice the size since last time," she said. "That's because I chase the birds off every morning," Grace replied. Hannah turned, hands on her hips. "You're gonna have a baby," Grace raised an eyebrow. "You always say the first thing that comes to mind," Abigail laughed behind her, brushing dust from her sleeves. "She's been asking since we left Reno," she said. "Had to promise we'd stay at least a week." They did. Abigail helped Grace wash linens and mend seams while Israel and Hannah walked the fence line and checked the traps near the ridge. On the third evening, they all sat around the fire with coffee and sweetbread, the night air cool and still. Abigail glanced at Grace, then Israel. "You two got plans for when it comes. We'll keep close to the house," Israel said. "If the weather holds, we'll be fine." "And if it doesn't," Grace met her gaze, "then we'll keep warm and wait it out." Abigail nodded once. "I'll return before the snow." "Just in case." That winter, the snow came early but soft. The baby arrived under a full moon with only Israel and Grace in the room, her cries sharp and strong. Israel wrapped her in a wool blanket and held her like something sacred. Grace, pale and calm, watched him with a steady gaze. "She's got your eyes," he said. "She's got your mouth," Grace whispered. Always said in that line. They named her Clara. By spring, she was smiling in her sleep and gripping Grace's finger with surprising strength. Israel built a rocker from leftover cedar and sanded it smooth as glass. Grace planted cabbage and squash with Clara bundled to her chest, humming half-remembered lullabies from a childhood that felt like someone else's. One afternoon, Israel came back from the Ellis Ranch with a message. They wanted to trade for seed and could offer 4 laying hens and a sack of oats in return. Grace agreed without pause, loading the cart herself and fixing the wheel when it jammed on a stone. That night, after Clara fell asleep, Israel pulled Grace's chair closer to his near the hearth. "You still feel wild?" he asked. She looked at him over her stitching. "Why?" "Because I think I love you more now than I did the day we married." Grace set the cloth in her lap. "That's a dangerous thing to say." "Truth usually is." She leaned into him, their shoulders touching. "I don't feel wild anymore." He turned to her, brow lifted. "I feel home," she said. He kissed the corner of her mouth, slow and sure. The fire popped. Clara stirred once, then settled. Outside, the garden stretched green and full. The fence held, the roof stayed dry. The land had accepted them, and they had given themselves to it in return. They did not speak of fear anymore, only of seasons, of Clara's first tooth, of what kind of lumber they'd need to build a smokehouse come fall. The cabin stood solid through summer and into the next winter. Abigail returned with Hannah and stayed for 2 months, helping Grace with Clara while Israel added shelves to the second room. They shared stories by lamplight, dried apples by the stove, and strung herbs from the rafters. When they parted again, there was no sadness, only plans for the next visit, and the knowledge that they were no longer alone in the world. Grace and Israel watched the wagon disappear down the ridge. Clara pressed between them, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You still think we're just 2 runaways?" Grace asked. "No," Israel said, brushing a curl from her temple. "I think we're a beginning." She rested her head against his chest, the wind curling around them. The land stretched still and wide, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like theirs, and it always would.